Step away from the animal, ma'am. Genevieve Mercer did not step away from the animal. She sat firmly upon a tall wooden stool behind the polished cedar counter of Mercer's Conservatory and Rare Botanicals, her broad shoulders straight, her hands resting calmly in the folds of her vibrant crimson-red knitted wrap dress. Across her lap, sprawled with the total, unapologetic weight of an overturned marble column, lay 140 pounds of pure, corded muscle, a jet-black cane corso mastiff, whose broad, blocky skull was currently resting against her soft waist like an overgrown lapdog. He was snoring. It was not a polite snore. It was a rhythmic, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of the historic Victorian glasshouse, rattling the delicate glass specimen jars of dried chamomile and crushed cloves lining the lower shelf. Standing 6 paces away, blocking the sun-drenched double-glass doors of the greenhouse, were 4 men dressed in bespoke charcoal suits that cost more than Genevieve's entire quarterly heating bill. They had entered without knocking, their leather soles silent against the terracotta tiles, their postures rigid with the lethal, rehearsed choreography of men who carried concealed Glock 19s beneath their tailored armpits. "Ma'am," the man in front spoke again. His voice was clipped, polite in that terrifyingly sterile way that belonged exclusively to corporate fixers and high-ranking syndicates. "The hound belongs to Don Vance Thorne. We have been instructed to secure him and bring him home immediately. Please remove your hands from his collar." The dog, whom Genevieve had spent the last 14 days calling Barnaby, despite the heavy silver signet band around his neck that read Goliath, did not move a single muscle. He merely cracked open one amber eye, assessed the 4 armed men with the profound, heavy-lidded contempt of a creature who had seen the bottom of the world and found it thoroughly unimpressive, and then let out a wet, whistling sigh. Slowly, deliberately, the massive black beast tucked his leathery black snout deeper into the warm folds of Genevieve's crimson dress, closed his eye, and went back to sleep. Genevieve kept her hand resting gently between the dog's velvet ears, her fingers casually tracing the ridge of his skull. "He seems quite settled," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. The enforcer's left eyebrow twitched. "He is property of the Thorne Syndicate." "He is a living creature," Genevieve replied, meeting the man's cold stare with the calm, unwavering clarity of her hazel amber eyes. "And at the moment, he is sleeping off 2 bowls of roasted bone broth and half a pound of braised chicken. If you attempt to drag 140 pounds of dead weight across my newly waxed floorboards, you will only succeed in ruining your trousers and embarrassing yourselves." "Ma'am, stand down, Marcus." The 5th man stepped through the doorway. The 4 enforcers immediately parted, their spines snapping straight, their eyes dropping to the floor in unison. The ambient temperature inside the humid, sun-drenched conservatory seemed to plummet by 10 degrees in a single second. Don Vance Thorne entered the glasshouse. Genevieve had spent the last 2 weeks reading the whispered headlines in the city's business gazettes, constructing an image of the man who ran the eastern waterfront. She had expected something crude, something loud, gold-draped, and visibly violent, the kind of underworld brute who announced his authority by shattering glass and raising his voice. Vance Thorne was none of those things. He was 37 years old, standing a towering 6'4", with the immense, wide-shouldered frame of a competitive heavyweight bodybuilder wrapped in an immaculate, razor-sharp 3-piece charcoal wool suit. His dark, charcoal black hair was swept back cleanly, threaded with striking strands of silver at the temples. A sharp, square jaw, shadowed by dark, permanent stubble, framed a pair of piercing, icy steel-blue eyes that did not look at a room. They catalogued its structural weaknesses, its occupants, and its exits within the span of a single breath. A faint, razor-thin white scar traced horizontally across his high left cheekbone, the only visible imperfection on a face carved from cold, uncompromising granite. He did not walk with hurried urgency. He moved with the terrifying, effortless stillness of an apex predator who knew, with absolute mathematical certainty, that every wall, every person, and every bullet in this city would rearrange itself to accommodate his presence. He stopped 3 paces from the counter, his broad chest rising and falling beneath his crisp white dress shirt. His steel blue gaze dropped to the massive black dog snoring in Genevieve's lap. Goliath did not rise. The dog's cropped ear rotated back slightly at the sound of the familiar leather boots, but his heavy body remained completely limp, his chin wedged securely against Genevieve's soft, full-figured thigh. A muscle in Vance Thorne's chiseled jaw ticked once, a fracture in the stone. "That," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Genevieve's chest, "is a tactical war dog trained to dismantle armed assailants in 4 seconds. Genevieve looked down at the snoring black mountain, whose tongue had slipped out slightly between his massive black jowls. "Well," Genevieve said evenly, "he currently appears to be a very expensive weighted blanket." 14 days earlier, the city had been swallowed by an unseasonably violent autumn storm. It had been nearly midnight when the torrential rain began hammering against the iron-framed glass panes of the conservatory, turning the dark streets of the old riverfront heritage district into churning black rivers. Genevieve had been staying late in the potting shed behind the glass house, steeping large glass carboys of dried elderberry, valerian root, and organic witch hazel for her apothecary tinctures. The heritage glasshouse had belonged to her grandfather, Arthur Mercer, an eccentric botanist who had spent 40 years cultivating rare heirloom orchids and medicinal flora before passing the deed into Genevieve's capable hands 3 years ago. At 25, Genevieve had preserved every square foot of it through sheer grit, financial discipline, and 18-hour workdays. She was not a delicate, wilting flower. She was a voluptuous, full-figured woman of 5'4", with fair, glowing white skin, wide hips, and strong, calloused hands that could heave 50-pound bags of potting soil without breaking a sweat. As the clock struck midnight that stormy night, a low, wet scratching sound had echoed against the wooden service door at the rear of the potting shed. When Genevieve had cracked the heavy timber door open, expecting a stray alley cat seeking shelter from the gale, she had frozen. Sprawled across the wet flagstones was the largest black canine she had ever seen in her life. His sleek, muscular coat was soaked through with freezing rainwater. Mud caked into his flanks, and a deep, jagged laceration ran along his right shoulder, where a high-caliber bullet had grazed the muscle. His breathing had been shallow, rattling in his massive chest, his golden amber eyes clouded with pain and utter exhaustion. Any other woman in the district would have screamed and slammed the door shut. Genevieve had merely knelt in the freezing rain. She had not run. She had not called animal control. She had reached out her bare hand, palm upturned, allowing the massive predator to catch the scent of sweet almond oil, cedarwood, and rain on her skin, when the dying beast had weakly rested his burning, feverish snout against her palm. Genevieve had dragged him inside. For 3 sleepless nights, she had turned the potting shed into a makeshift surgical suite. She had boiled pots of pure mountain spring water, stitched the torn muscle with sterile surgical nylon, and applied thick, generous layers of her homemade chamomile, comfrey, and raw beeswax salve to fight off the infection. When the dog had refused dry commercial kibble, she had roasted whole pasture-raised chickens in her small studio apartment above the greenhouse, shredding the warm, tender meat into rich, slow-simmered bone broth and hand-feeding him spoonful by spoonful. On the 4th morning, the dog had opened his clear amber eyes, stood up on all four massive paws, and followed Genevieve into the greenhouse. He had not left her side since. He had claimed the thick wool rug beneath her cedar counter. When she watered the hanging ferns, he walked 3 inches behind her hip, his broad flank brushing against her crimson wrap dress. When she potted rare white gardenias, he sat with his giant paws crossed over her boots, resting his heavy chin on her knee while she hummed old folk tunes. Genevieve had noticed the heavy silver signet ring welded into his custom Kevlar collar, bearing the embossed crest of a crowned raven over a crossed dagger. She had known, in the quiet recesses of her sharp mind, that an animal of this pedigree and training did not belong to an ordinary citizen. She had known that somewhere in the gilded high-rises across the river, powerful men were tearing the city apart, looking for their lost weapon. She had known this day would come. She simply hadn't expected the weapon to choose her lap over his master. Back in the bright, sun-drenched conservatory, the silence between Genevieve and Don Vance Thorne stretched for 5 long seconds. Vance took one slow, deliberate step closer to the counter. The custom wool of his charcoal jacket stretched tight over his massive shoulders, revealing the immense physical power beneath his tailored elegance. He looked down at Genevieve, his steel blue eyes sweeping over her radiant fair white skin, the soft swell of her waist in the vivid crimson knit dress, and the utter lack of panic in her posture. Most people in this city trembled when Vance Thorne looked at them. Mayors sweated through their collars, rival cartel bosses checked their rear-view mirrors, hardened enforcers spoke in hushed, reverent whispers. This curvy, flower-dusted botanist merely looked back at him like he was a customer who had arrived 5 minutes before opening hours. "Goliath," Vance commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried the sharp, absolute authority of a warlord, ordering an army to march. "Heel!" The dog's left rear paw twitched. A low, sleepy grunt escaped his throat. He did not get up. In fact, he stretched his massive front legs forward, digging his blunt black nails into Genevieve's apron, and let out a long, shuddering sigh of pure domestic bliss. Marcus, the lead enforcer, reached inside his jacket with a dark scowl. "Boss, let me grab the lead." "Touch him," Genevieve said, her hazel eyes turning like flint as she looked directly at the armed fixer. "And he will take your arm off before you clear leather. He does not like men who smell of cheap cologne and gun oil." Marcus froze, his hand caught beneath his lapel. Vance Thorne held up a single, large, scarred hand, halting his men without looking back. His icy gaze remained locked on Genevieve's face. "He went missing 14 nights ago," Vance said, his voice dangerously smooth. "We were ambushed near the river crossing by 3 vehicles. Goliath cleared 2 shooters from my driver's window before taking a round to the shoulder and going over the embankment. My men searched 7 square miles of marshland for 6 days. He had a high-velocity graze on his deltoid and a secondary infection from swamp water," Genevieve stated calmly. "His fever was 104 when he crawled to my back door. If your men had spent less time looking for a weapon and more time checking local glass houses with warm stoves, you would have found him 12 days ago." One of the enforcers in the back let out a sharp, choked cough, quickly disguising it as a throat clearing. Vance did not blink. "You treated a gunshot wound on an unfamiliar mastiff." "I am an apothecary," Genevieve replied, gesturing with a tilt of her chin toward the towering shelves of amber bottles, copper distillers, and dried botanical bundles hanging from the wrought-iron rafters. "I know how to sterilize tissue, suture muscle, and draw out sepsis with raw pine resin and comfrey. And I know when a dog has spent his entire life being treated like a piece of artillery instead of a companion." Vance's steel blue eyes narrowed, a razor-sharp intensity flickering in their depths. "He is worth $300,000 in specialized defense training. Then he is severely underpaid, Genevieve countered without missing a beat, because he worked for 2 weeks as my head of customer relations for the price of 3 rotisserie chickens and a warm fleece blanket. A strange, subtle shift occurred in Vance Thorne's expression. It was not a smile. Men who carried the weight of the city's shadows did not smile easily, but it was the unmistakable ghost of genuine, fascinated shock. It was the look of a man who had spent 40 years playing high-stakes chess, only to have his opponent casually sit down, pour 2 cups of tea, and politely decline to play by the rules. Vance looked down at the dog once more. He extended his large, calloused right hand, resting his knuckles near Goliath's broad snout. Goliath cracked an eye, sniffed his master's signet ring once, gave Vance's knuckle a single, perfunctory lick of acknowledgement, and then rested his chin back down on Genevieve's knee. "I know you," the dog's posture said. "I am glad you are alive. Now let me finish my nap." Vance slowly withdrew his hand. "He isn't coming with me today," Vance murmured, more to himself than to his men. "He has made his opinion quite clear," Genevieve said. Vance looked up, his gaze fixing upon Genevieve's hazel eyes with an intensity that made her pulse flutter beneath her calm exterior. 7:30 tomorrow morning, Vance said quietly. "We open at 8, Mr. Thorne." "I am aware," he said. Without another word, Don Vance Thorne turned on his polished heel and walked out of the conservatory, his 4 armed enforcers trailing behind him like dark shadows fleeing the dawn. Genevieve let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thumping of Goliath's tail against her shins. "You," Genevieve whispered, scratching the massive dog behind his velvety ears, "are going to get my greenhouse burned to the ground." Goliath merely snored in response. The bell above the heavy iron glasshouse doors chimed precisely at 7:30 a.m. the following morning. Genevieve was already behind the counter, her hair gathered into a lush, dark chestnut crown of curls, wearing a fitted crimson-red wrap dress that hugged her soft, voluptuous frame with radiant warmth. The air inside the glasshouse smelled of damp earth, blooming white jasmine, and freshly brewed dark roast espresso. The door swung open, and Don Vance Thorne stepped inside. He was alone. No black SUV idling at the curb. No armed guards blocking the sidewalk. No tactical backup. He wore a tailored charcoal grey wool vest over a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up twice, exposing thick, corded forearms covered in intricate dark ink and the subtle scars of a violent youth. He walked straight to the small wrought-iron cafe table, nestled between 2 flowering lemon trees in the sunlit corner of the room, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Goliath, who had been resting beneath the propagation tables, trotted out immediately, his massive tail sweeping across the floor tiles, and leaned his heavy ribcage against Vance's knee. Vance's large hand came down automatically, his long, scarred fingers burying themselves into the dog's thick black fur, scratching with a practiced, rhythmic gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with his terrifying reputation. Genevieve watched them for 3 seconds before picking up a white ceramic mug, filling it to the brim with dark roast coffee, and walking across the tiled floor. She set the steaming mug and a small porcelain plate, holding 2 warm, freshly baked lavender citrus scones on the table in front of him. Vance looked at the plate, then looked up at Genevieve. "I didn't order breakfast." "It's 7:30 in the morning," Genevieve replied, setting a small dish of clotted cream beside the plate. "You have dark circles beneath your eyes, your jaw is locked like an iron vice, and you look like a man who runs an empire on 3 hours of sleep and nicotine. Eat the scone, Mr. Thorne. It won't kill you." "Is that a professional guarantee from an apothecary?" Vance asked, a dry, velvety rumble in his tone. "It is a guarantee from a woman who bakes with unpasteurized butter and fresh lemon zest, she replied smoothly. And you take your coffee black, correct? How do you know that? Men who carry the weight of 3,000 people on their shoulders rarely have the patience for sugar, Genevieve said simply, turning back toward her counter. Vance watched her walk away, his steel blue eyes tracking the confident, graceful sway of her crimson dress. He picked up the ceramic mug, took a slow sip, and closed his eyes for a single, rare moment of peace. He stayed for 45 minutes. He did not ask about the dog. He did not issue commands. He simply sat in the warm, fragrant sanctuary of the glass house, drinking black coffee, scratching the sleeping war dog at his feet, and watching Genevieve work. He watched the way she moved between the wooden shelves, her fair white skin glowing beneath the morning sun, her strong, graceful hands trimming dead leaves from fragile orchids with surgical precision. And then, he noticed something else. Whenever Genevieve paused to calculate invoices or review shipping receipts in her leather-bound ledger, her left hand would unconsciously reach for the display of amber glass apothecary jars on the counter. She would pick them up, one by one, rearranging them into strict, symmetrical rows, lavender on the left, chamomile in the center, valerian on the right. If a jar was rotated 3 degrees out of alignment, she would adjust it until the labels faced perfectly forward. "You've moved that cedarwood jar 4 times in 10 minutes, Vance noted from his table, his deep voice slicing through the quiet hum of the glass house. Genevieve froze mid-adjustment, her fingers resting on the glass stopper. She looked over her shoulder at him. "The labels are supposed to face east," she said defensively. "Why east?" "Because the morning light catches the amber glass and creates a symmetrical reflection across the polished cedar counter," she said, lifting her chin with dignified pride. "Symmetry brings order to a chaotic world. It is calming." Vance set his empty coffee cup down. "Are you feeling chaotic today, Miss Mercer?" Genevieve turned fully toward him, crossing her arms over her chest, the vibrant crimson of her wrap dress highlighting the radiant, creamy warmth of her porcelain skin. "I run an independent botanical conservatory in a historic district that is currently being targeted by predatory commercial developers," Genevieve said with crisp, articulate precision. "I am currently serving dark roast coffee to the most feared syndicate don in the tri-state area, while harboring his military-grade war dog. The number of things that could catastrophically unravel my life before noon sits somewhere between 8 and 14. Measured anxiety seems entirely practical." Vance was quiet for several beats. His gaze swept over her, not with the crude, calculating appraisal she was used to from city officials, but with the profound, unhurried respect of a man who recognized raw, unyielding courage when he saw it. "You are in no danger from me, Genevieve," Vance said quietly. His voice dropped into an intimate, solemn register that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Not now, not ever." Genevieve looked at him, searching the icy depths of his steel blue eyes for deceit, manipulation, or arrogance. She found none. "I know," Genevieve whispered, surprised by how deeply she meant it. "How do you know?" Vance asked. Genevieve gestured toward the floor beside his boots, where the massive, 140-pound cane corso was currently lying on his back. All 4 giant paws pointed toward the glass ceiling, snoring happily, while Vance absent-mindedly rubbed his broad chest. "Because," Genevieve said softly, a genuine, radiant smile touching her lips, "a monster cannot teach a war dog how to sleep with his belly exposed. That kind of trust is earned." Vance did not answer, but something deep behind his guarded, battle-hardened eyes softened, a crack appearing in the impenetrable armor he had worn for 37 years. Over the next 3 weeks, A new rhythm took root inside Mercer's conservatory. Vance Thorne arrived every morning at 7:30 a.m. He never brought guards. He never spoke on his phone inside the glasshouse. He sat at the corner table, drank his black coffee, and spoke with Genevieve about things that had nothing to do with extortion, port shipments, or city politics. Genevieve learned that he had grown up on the docks, the son of an honest shipbuilder who had been ruined by corrupt municipal bankers. She learned that he slept barely 4 hours a night, that he read 19th century military history to silence his racing thoughts, and that beneath his tailored wool suits lay a man who was profoundly, deeply exhausted by a world where every conversation was a transaction. Vance learned that Genevieve had lost both her parents in a train derailment when she was 12, that her grandfather had raised her among the ferns and potting soil, and that she possessed a genius-level understanding of plant biochemistry and tax accounting. He learned that she loved classical cello music, that she refused to use synthetic pesticides, and that she possessed a fiery, unbreakable sense of self-worth that no amount of money could intimidate. By the 4th week, Goliath had divided his life with absolute precision. He spent his nights guarding Vance's secure penthouse suite across the river, and his mornings lounging beneath Genevieve's cedar counter, acting as the self-appointed guardian of the glasshouse. And then, on a rainy Thursday morning, the shadow of the outside world finally breached the sanctuary. The glasshouse doors were shoved open with rude, excessive force at 11 a.m. Harrison Drake walked in. Drake was 46, tall, slick, and drenched in the arrogant entitlement of a multi-millionaire commercial real estate developer. He wore an expensive camel hair overcoat, dripping rainwater onto the clean terracotta tiles, and carried a thick leather portfolio beneath his arm. Behind him stood 2 burly private security guards in yellow rain slickers. Drake had been circling the Heritage District for 18 months, aggressively buying out century-old family businesses, demolishing historic brick facades, and erecting sterile, overpriced luxury condominium towers. He had visited the conservatory 3 times in the past year, offering Genevieve insulting, lowball purchase buyouts, and subtly threatening to have her heritage occupancy charter revoked by the city planning board. "Well, well," Drake sneered, his cold, small eyes sweeping over the humid glasshouse, before landing on Genevieve behind the counter. "Still playing in the dirt, Genevieve?" Genevieve did not flinch. She set down her brass watering can, wiping her hands on her linen towel, her crimson dress a striking beacon against the lush green ferns. "Good morning, Mr. Drake," she said evenly. "If you are here to buy rare orchids, the counter is open. If you are here to waste my time with another predatory acquisition proposal, the exit is behind you." Drake let out a wet, condescending laugh, stepping closer to the counter and leaning his hands against the polished cedar. "You're remarkably cocky for a plump little shopkeeper whose business is hanging by a thread," Drake hissed, unzipping his leather portfolio and slapping a thick stack of legal documents onto the wood. "This is a municipal zoning revision, signed by the chairman of the District Development Council yesterday afternoon. Your grandfather's heritage tax exemption has been reclassified. Your annual commercial property tax just tripled, effective 30 days from today." Genevieve's heart skipped a beat, but her face remained entirely calm, her fair white skin radiating cool, unshakable dignity. "The Mercer Charter has an irrevocable 60-year grandfather clause," Genevieve said steadily. "A municipal zoning board cannot retroactively nullify a state historical covenant." "It can, when the zoning board works for my holding company, sweetheart," Drake sneered, tapping the papers with a manicured finger. "You have 3 choices. You can pay the $280,000 back tax reassessment in 30 days. You can watch the city sheriff padlock your doors, or you can sign this deed transfer right now, take my $50,000 payout, and walk away with your dignity intact." Drake leaned forward, his voice dropping into a venomous, patronizing whisper. "Be a smart girl. A woman like you isn't built to fight real men in the real world. Take the check, pack your little flower pots, and find yourself a husband before this building is demolished around your ears." Genevieve looked at the papers, then looked straight into Harrison Drake's sneering face. "I would rather burn this glass house to the ground with my own 2 hands, Genevieve said, her voice ringing with absolute, crystal-clear conviction, than let a parasitic coward like you pour concrete over my family's legacy. Get out of my shop." Drake's face twisted with ugly, violent fury. He raised his hand, pointing a threatening finger inches from Genevieve's nose. "Listen to me, you fat little." A sound echoed through the glass house. It was not a bark. It was not a growl. It was a low, subsonic vibration of pure, lethal malice that rattled the glass panes overhead. Harrison Drake froze mid-sentence. From the leafy botanical archway beside the private greenhouse corridor, a massive shadow detached itself from the foliage. Goliath stepped forward, his 140 pounds of coiled black muscle lowering into a battle stance, his lips curling back over massive, razor-sharp white canines, his golden eyes glowing with pure predatory rage. And walking half a pace behind the war dog, his hands casually resting in the pockets of his tailored charcoal trousers, was Don Vance Thorne. The air in the glass house became unbreathable. Drake's 2 private security guards took one look at Vance Thorne, turned completely white, and backed up against the glass double doors, their hands raised in total panicked surrender. "To Thorne?" Drake stammered, his arrogant sneer instantly collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Mr. Thorne, I didn't... What are you doing here?" Vance did not answer immediately. He walked with slow, measured steps across the terracotta floor, stopping 2 feet from Drake. Standing at 6'4", with his massive, broad-shouldered physique, Vance completely towered over the developer, casting an immense, suffocating shadow across the counter. Vance did not raise his voice. When a man like Vance Thorne spoke, loudness was unnecessary. His quietness was what promised death. "Who authorized you?" Vance asked softly, "to speak in this room?" I was simply delivering a legal municipal notice," Drake squeaked, sweat suddenly beading along his receding hairline. "Business between private property owners. Standard redevelopment procedures." Vance reached out one large, scarred hand and casually picked up the legal document from the counter. He scanned the first page with cold, bored detachment. "Harrison Drake," Vance read in a low, level monotone. "Apex Urban Holdings, a shell corporation registered under 3 offshore trusts in the Caymans, funded through subordinate loans provided by the Continental Merchant Bank." Vance looked up, his icy steel blue eyes locking onto Drake's trembling face. 3 days ago, Vance continued smoothly, the Thorne Syndicate purchased 72% of Continental Merchant Bank's distressed debt portfolios, which means, Harrison, I own your loans, I own your construction credit lines, I own your mortgages, and by 6 o'clock this evening, I will own the building your mother lives in. Drake's knees visibly buckled. "Mr. Thorne, please, I didn't know, I had no idea this property was under syndicate protection." "This property is not under syndicate protection," Vance interrupted, his voice dropping into a lethal, freezing whisper that chilled the room to the bone. "This property belongs to Genevieve Mercer, and the woman standing behind this counter is someone whose peace I have personally guaranteed." Vance slowly, deliberately ripped the thick legal document in half. Then, in quarters, he dropped the shredded paper into Drake's trembling hands. "You have until 5 o'clock today to dissolve your zoning petition, resign from the Heritage Commission, and wire a formal written apology to this address," Vance whispered, leaning in until his lips were inches from Drake's ear. "If I ever see your car within 4 blocks of this district again, you will discover exactly what Goliath does to men who forget their manners. Do you understand me?" Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Thorne. Right away," Drake gasped. Drake turned and sprinted out of the glass house, so fast he nearly shattered the front glass doors, his 2 guards fleeing behind him, like whipped dogs into the pouring rain. The glass house fell completely silent. Genevieve stood behind the counter, her hands resting flat against the cedar wood, her breath coming slightly faster, her crimson dress glowing vibrantly in the returning morning light. She looked at Vance. Vance was standing very still, his broad chest rising and falling, his hands returning to his pockets. Goliath sat beside his boots, looking up at Genevieve with a happy, expectant pant. "You didn't have to do that," Genevieve said quietly. Vance looked at her, his expression returning to its cold, guarded neutrality. He was trespassing on private property. "He was trying to destroy my life," Genevieve corrected softly, her hazel eyes searching his face. "And you dismantled an entire multi-million-dollar corporation in 90 seconds with 3 sentences." "He made a mistake," Vance said simply. "I corrected it." Genevieve looked down at the shredded paper scattered across the floor, and a profound, heavy weight settled in her chest. She had felt a surge of undeniable, intoxicating warmth when Vance had stepped between her and Drake, a feeling of being fiercely, undeniably protected. But Genevieve was a woman of numbers, a woman who understood the high, dangerous cost of debts and obligations. One moment of rescue in a glass house did not erase the reality of who Vance Thorne was. He was a syndicate kingpin. Violence followed his footsteps like a shadow. And Genevieve had spent her entire adult life building a world that was small, honest, and entirely her own. She looked at the massive dog resting his chin on Vance's knee, and then she looked back up at the towering Don. "Mr. Thorne," Genevieve said, her voice dropping into a solemn, heartbreakingly clear tone. "We need to talk." The late afternoon sun was casting long, golden geometric shadows across the glass house when Genevieve placed a small, polished silver object onto the cedar counter. It was Goliath's heavy silver signet collar. Vance stood across from her, his charcoal jacket unbuttoned, his tall frame rigid as stone. "His shoulder is completely healed," Genevieve said softly, meeting Vance's piercing steel-blue gaze without flinching. "The sutures dissolved 4 days ago. He has gained back the 12 pounds he lost in the storm. He is strong, healthy, and alert." Vance looked at the silver collar on the wood, then looked up at Genevieve. He did not speak. "There is no veterinary reason for you to keep coming here at 7:30 in the morning," Genevieve continued, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "And there is no professional reason for you to sit at my counter for 45 minutes every day." The silence between them had texture. It was thick, fragile, and heavy with unspoken truths. "Genevieve, I am grateful for what you did today," Genevieve interrupted gently, her hazel amber eyes shining with quiet pride and fierce self-respect. "I am more grateful than you will ever know, but I am not a naive girl who gets swept away by powerful men with dangerous empires. I have built a life here. It is quiet. It is honest. It is mine." She leaned slightly across the counter, her fair, radiant face inches from his. "I will not become a convenient morning distraction for a Mafia Don who comes here to escape the blood on his hands," she whispered. "I will not be a hobby, and I will not be someone you manage like an asset in your portfolio. You are used to rooms where people submit to your gravity because they fear you or because they want something from you. "I want nothing from you, Vance, except honesty." Vance stood entirely motionless. The muscles in his massive jaw shifted, his throat working as he swallowed the heavy weight of her words. He looked at her radiant, voluptuous beauty, the proud curve of her shoulders in her crimson wrap dress, the undeniable intelligence in her gaze. He had spent 20 years commanding hardened criminals, corrupt politicians, and brutal cartel enforcers. None of them had ever possessed the courage to look him in the eye and demand that he earn their presence. Vance slowly reached out his large, scarred hand. He picked up the silver collar from the counter and slipped it into his pocket. He looked down at Goliath, scratching the massive dog once behind his ears, with a tender, devastating gentleness. "Understood," Vance said softly. He looked at Genevieve for 3 long, agonizing seconds, a look filled with an ache so profound it nearly broke her resolve, and then he turned and walked out of the glass house. He did not look back. The next morning, Don Vance Thorne did not come. The morning after that, the wrought-iron cafe table in the sunlit corner remained empty. Genevieve arrived at the conservatory every day at 6 a.m., unlocked the doors, swept the terracotta tiles, and brewed a full pot of dark roast espresso. She poured a single white ceramic mug, set it on the counter, and did not look at the empty iron stool. She reorganized the amber glass apothecary jars 5 times in a single morning. She checked the ledger balances twice. She repotted 48 white gardenias until her hands were stained with dark, rich soil. She had wanted proof that her life was still entirely hers. She had it. The conservatory was safe. Harrison Drake had formally withdrawn all zoning petitions and fled the state. Her business was solvent. Her mornings were quiet. Yet every time the brass bell above the door chimed, a sharp, suffocating ache bloomed in the center of her chest, a phantom number missing from a column that refused to balance. Across the river, in the soaring penthouse overlooking the city's glittering skyline, Don Vance Thorne was losing a war he couldn't fight with weapons. Goliath was physically present in the penthouse. The dog ate his prime cuts of beef on schedule. He slept on his imported leather bed, but every morning at precisely 7:15 a.m., the massive black beast would sit directly in front of the private elevator doors, his heavy head resting against the brass trim, letting out long, mournful whines that echoed through the empty, sterile marble corridors. Vance would sit at his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by international shipping manifests, financial audits, and multi-million-dollar contracts, and find himself staring at the wall. He found himself looking at his watch at 7:29 a.m. He found himself remembering the scent of wild chamomile, crushed cedar, and lemon zest. He found himself thinking about a beautiful, curvy woman in a crimson-red dress who rearranged amber jars when she was thinking deeply, a woman whose radiant smile had brought more light into his cold, brutal existence than 20 years of absolute power ever could. He had told himself he went to the glass house because of the dog. Then, because the dog needed monitoring. Then, because he was protecting her from developers. And then, Genevieve Mercer had quietly, surgically stripped away every single lie, leaving him standing naked before the only truth that mattered. For the first time in 37 years, Don Vance Thorne was completely, hopelessly in love. 22 days after he had last walked out of her doors, the brass bell above Mercer's conservatory chimed at precisely 7:30 a.m. on a crisp, golden autumn morning. Genevieve looked up from the cedar counter, her breath catching in her throat, the ceramic coffee pot frozen mid-pour. Don Vance Thorne stood in the doorway. He had no convoy, no armed enforcers. He wore a crisp white dress shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, an unbuttoned charcoal wool jacket, and dark trousers. His hands were empty. He carried no folders, no legal contracts, no business pretexts, no weapons. And trotting through the door beside his long legs, his tail wagging, with the triumphant, smug certainty of a four-legged matchmaking genius, was Goliath. The massive cane corso trotted straight across the conservatory, pushed his huge, velvety black head under Genevieve's apron, and rested his chin happily on her soft thigh, letting out a loud, shuddering sigh of pure relief. Genevieve's eyes moved from the dog to the towering man standing before her. Vance walked across the terracotta tiles with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped at the counter, pulled out the tall wooden stool, and sat down. For the first time since she had met him, Don Vance Thorn looked down at his own hands. The most powerful crime lord in the city, a man whose word decided the fate of empires, sat with his scarred, calloused fingers resting on the cedar wood, completely unguarded, completely vulnerable. "I spent 3 weeks," Vance said, his voice raw, deep, and thick with unmasked emotion, trying to find a legitimate business reason to walk through that door. "I looked for zoning irregularities. I looked for import suppliers, for your rare soil mixes. I tried to convince myself that Goliath was exhibiting signs of separation anxiety." He paused, lifting his head, his icy steel-blue eyes locking onto Genevieve's hazel-amber gaze with a ferocity of honest devotion that made the room spin. "Every explanation I started," Vance whispered, "was a coward's lie, and you told me you only accept honesty." Genevieve leaned against the counter, her heart pounding with fierce, soaring warmth. "What is the honest reason, Vance?" Vance Thorn did not reach for an angle. He did not reach for armor. "I came back," Vance said, his voice steady, absolute, and filled with a lifetime of devotion, "because you are the only place in this entire city where I can breathe. Because you are the smartest, fiercest, most breathtaking woman I have ever laid eyes on. I came back because I want to sit across from you at 7:30 every morning. I want to drink your black coffee. I want to watch you rearrange your amber jars, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are not my hobby. You are my sanctuary." He held her gaze, refusing to look away. "I want to take you to dinner tonight," Vance said softly, "and I want to figure out everything else from there." Genevieve looked at him for 3 long, breathless seconds. She looked at the vulnerability in his sharp, masculine face. She looked at the giant black dog snoring peacefully across her feet. She looked at the man who had laid down his weapons, his pride, and his armor, simply for the privilege of sitting in her morning light. Genevieve slowly picked up the ceramic coffee pot. She reached for a clean white ceramic mug, filled it to the brim with rich, steaming dark roast coffee, and set it gently between Vance's large hands. "Okay," Genevieve whispered, her radiant face breaking into a breathtaking, dazzling smile that lit up the entire Victorian glasshouse. "Dinner at 7. Vance Thorn let out a slow, shuddering breath. Something in his massive, wide shoulders dropped a full inch. The physical release of a man who had carried the crushing weight of the world for 37 years, and finally, miraculously, found a home where he could lay it down. Goliath lifted his massive head, looked at Vance, looked at Genevieve, let out a satisfied snort, and curled into a contented black ball beneath the counter. His mission was complete. 6 months later, things had changed, and yet nothing had changed at all. Mercer's Conservatory and Rare Botanicals was more vibrant than ever. The historic glass house remained an independent sanctuary of blooming orchids, fragrant jasmine, and handcrafted medicinal tinctures. Every morning, at precisely 7:30 a.m., the brass bell would chime, and Don Vance Thorn would walk through the double glass doors. Sometimes he came in a three-piece suit before a morning board meeting. Sometimes he came in a soft cashmere sweater on a lazy Sunday. But he always sat at the same wrought-iron table beneath the flowering lemon trees, drinking black dark roast espresso and watching his radiant, voluptuous wife move gracefully between the green ferns in her signature crimson-red dresses. They had drawn clear, unyielding boundaries from the very beginning. Genevieve touched none of his syndicate logistics, and Vance never brought his underworld violence past the threshold of the glass house. It was a partnership built on mutual sovereignty, ferocious loyalty, and profound, unshakable respect. She still reorganized the amber apothecary jars when she was thinking deeply. Vance still watched her with undivided, mesmerized fascination, learning every single day the beautiful, vital difference between watching a woman with reverence and trying to manage her. And sprawled across the plush crimson Persian rug between their chairs, snoring loudly enough to rattle the glass roof while soaking in the warm morning sun, lay a 140-pound tactical war dog who had understood from the very first thunderstorm. Some beasts do not need to be commanded. They simply need to find the woman who gives them a reason to stay.